Today's lesson is on congruence in overlapping triangles. Take a minute to read the learning goal and scale. Find where you are on the scale before we begin the lesson. We can sometimes use the congruent corresponding parts of one pair of congruent triangles to prove another pair of triangles congruent. This often involves overlapping triangles. Overlapping triangles may have a common side or angle. We can simplify our work with overlapping triangles by separating and redrawing the triangles. In example 1, we will identify common parts. What common angle do triangle ACD and triangle ECB share? I like to look for a common letter in the names of the triangles when I'm looking for common parts. Since C is in both triangle names and it is the only letter that repeats, we know that angle C will be the common angle. You can also separate and redraw the triangles. Here is triangle ADC. Here is triangle ECB. Notice both triangles have angle C in common. Pause the video and do you try number 1. For part A, they ask what is the common side in triangle ABD and triangle DCA. If I want to use the names of the triangles to help me out, I notice that letter A and D repeat in both triangle names. So I know that side AD is common. I can also redraw the triangles. Notice that side AD is in both triangles. So side AD is the common side. Part B wants to know what is the common side in triangle ABD and triangle BAC. Again, if I want to use the names of the triangles to help me out, I notice that the letters A and B are in both triangle names, so I know side AB will be the common side. However, I can also redraw the triangles. Notice that side BA is in both triangles, so side AB or side BA is the common side. In example 2, we will use common parts of triangles to prove that side ZW is congruent to side YX. Let's start by separating triangle WZX and triangle XYW. Now let's look at the given statements. We know that angle ZXW is congruent to angle YWX. We also know that angle ZWX is congruent to angle YXW. Those are given. Notice our common side, WX, is in both triangles. So by the reflexive property of congruence, side WX is congruent to side XW. By angle side angle, we have congruent triangles. So we know that triangle ZWX is congruent to triangle YXW by angle side angle. And finally, we can prove that side ZW is congruent to side YX because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. Pause the video and do you try number 2. We want to prove that side CE is congruent to side DE. Let's start with the given that triangle ACD is congruent to triangle BDC. Since corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, we know that angle ADC is congruent to angle BCD. And by the converse of the isosceles triangle theorem, side CE is congruent to side DE. Remember, if the base angles of a triangle are congruent, the sides opposite those angles are congruent. In example 3, we will use 2 pairs of triangles to prove that triangle GED is congruent to triangle JEB. Let's start with the given statement that point E is the midpoint of segment AC and the midpoint of segment DB. By the definition of midpoint, segment AE is congruent to segment CE and segment DE is congruent to segment BE. Since vertical angles are congruent, angle AED is congruent to angle CEB. By side angle side, triangle AED is congruent to triangle CEB. Since corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, angle D is congruent to angle B. Since vertical angles are congruent, angle GED is congruent to angle JEB. By angle side angle, triangle GED is congruent to triangle JEB. Pause the video and do U try number 3. We want to prove that triangle QPT is congruent to triangle QRT. Let's start by outlining our triangles. We know that segment PS is congruent to segment RS and that angle PSQ is congruent to angle RSQ because it is given. By the reflexive property of congruence, segment SQ is congruent to segment SQ. By side angle side, we know that triangle PSQ is congruent to triangle RSQ. Since corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, we know that side PQ is congruent to side RQ and angle PQS is congruent to angle RQS. By the reflexive property of congruence, we know that segment QT is congruent to segment QT. So by side angle side, we know that triangle QPT is congruent to triangle QRT. In example 4, we will separate overlapping triangles to prove that side BX is congruent to side DX. When several triangles overlap, you need to use one pair of congruent triangles to prove another pair congruent. You may find it helpful to draw a diagram of each pair of triangles. Let's start with the given information that side CA is congruent to side CE and side BA is congruent to side DE. Since triangle ACE is an isosceles triangle, we know its base angles, angle CAE and angle CEA, are congruent. Since side AE is in both of these triangles, by the reflexive property of congruence, we know that side AE is congruent to side AE. By side angle side, triangle ABE is congruent to triangle EDA. We've been working with these two triangles in our diagram. Now let's work with these two triangles. By CPCTC, angle ABE is congruent to angle EDA. Angle BXA is congruent to angle DXE because vertical angles are congruent. By angle side, triangle ABX is congruent to triangle EDX. And finally, since corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, side BX is congruent to side DX. CPCTC. Pause the video and do U try number 4. We are asked to prove that side BD is congruent to side FD. Notice that I have separated triangle ACD here from triangle AED here. Let's start with the given statements that angle CAD is congruent to angle EAD and that angle C is congruent to angle E. By the reflexive property of congruence, side AD is congruent to side AD. By the angle-side theorem, triangle ADC is congruent to triangle ADE. Now let's focus on these two triangles, this part here. Since corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, side CD of triangle ACD is congruent to side ED of triangle AED. Since vertical angles are congruent, angle BDC is congruent to angle FDE. By angle side angle, triangle BDC is congruent to triangle FDE. And finally, since corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, side BD is congruent to side FD. CPCTC. Now is your chance to see how well you understand the lesson. Pause the video and do the lesson check. Make sure that you check your answers on the next slide. Here are the answers for questions 1 through 4. And here are the answers for questions 5 through 7. If you don't understand, please make sure you ask me in class. If you rock the lesson check, go ahead and give the challenge a try. Now take another minute to reread the learning goal on the scale. See if you've climbed any higher on the scale since we've completed the lesson.